Hello, everybody. My talk is on antedating the Oxford English Dictionary. As you will be aware, the Oxford English Dictionary is a historical dictionary, which means it doesn't just tell you what a word means today, but what a word has meant in the past. The guiding principle, sometimes known as the historical principle of lexicography, is that the dictionary should give an account of the life story of each word. And how do we determine that life story? By looking at the historical evidence. And by evidence, I mean examples of the word in use at a particular date. Once we have a collection of reliably dated examples of a word in use, we can work out the historical sequence of that word's meanings and construct a dictionary entry which shows that sequence of meanings and explains how each new meaning of the word has developed from what came before. Now, a prerequisite to telling these word stories is having good evidence. And a key part of that evidence is the first appearance of a word, or rather, the first known appearance. Only a relatively small proportion of words have an unambiguous date of birth when someone specifically coins a word to denote a particular concept. With other words, it's just a question of finding the earliest instance that can be reliably dated. And that's what we mean by antedating. If we find a datable instance of a word that's earlier than the earliest that we already have, that's an antedating. For a word that's not yet in the OED, any antedatings we find during the process of compiling the entry for the word are simply part of our quite elaborate research process. Where there's already a published dictionary entry, especially one that was published some time ago, there is a very good chance that further antedatings can be found. Now, to really appreciate this, I think we need to go back to what it was like compiling an entry for the first edition of the OED. Nowadays, we're so used to the fact that we can type a word into an online database like the Internet Archive or a search engine like Google Books and instantly see thousands of examples of that word, which we can sort or filter by date. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, when the OED was originally compiled, everything was done on paper, which meant that the only examples of a word like, for example, gorilla, the only examples that an editor could see when they were compiling the entry were quotations written out or printed on slips of paper by people who had noticed that word being used in a particular text and sent them into the OED. The fact that the first edition of the dictionary was as good as it was is to a great extent thanks to the thousands of people, almost entirely unpaid volunteers, who collected evidence in this way. But the dictionary entries were based on a very partial sampling of evidence and could, of course, be improved. All you needed to do was to be looking at a text that hadn't previously been looked at, and you might well find an instance of a word that antedated what the OED editors had found. In fact, it became common practice among academics who were preparing, say, a new edition of an old manuscript text to make notes on any words they had noticed which were earlier than the earliest examples in the OED. Or if you were interested in the history of a particular word, you might look through texts which might have contained that word, and if you found any antedatings, you could then publish them or send them to the OED directly. Here's a typical example of a published list of antedatings. These were found by the British writer Margarita Lasky, who eventually sent in more than 250,000 quotations to the OED. She was one of the dictionary's great volunteer contributors. On the right, you can see that in the OED online version of the entry, the antedating she supplied for the noun dip, in the sense of an act of bathing, has been added to the OED, and at the moment, that's the earliest example we have of that sense of the word. The advent of computers, and in particular, the availability of large, searchable databases of text, has of course completely transformed the process of researching the history of words. And I'd like to explain this by telling you about another of the OED's great volunteer contributors, Fred Shapiro, who is currently a librarian and lecturer at Yale Law School. In fact, the story begins when Fred was a student studying at Harvard Law School in 1978. He has described himself as, quote, probably the most indifferent law student ever at Harvard. I think that's probably unfair, but he had joined the university's Tiddlywinks team. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the game of Tiddlywinks, but Fred became interested in researching the history of this game. In his research, he came across some examples of the word Tiddlywinks, which antedated the OED, and he sent his findings to Oxford in 1978. We still have his original letter and the slips of paper on which he sent in his quotations. And half a century later, Fred is still sending us antedatings that he's found in his research. He emails us something just about every week. Looking for antedatings can be like that. Once you get the habit, you never stop. But a few months after sending in those Tiddlywinks antedatings, Fred became aware of one of the first large searchable databases of historical text to be created, the Lexis database of case law and other legal documents, which he could access at Harvard. Of course, this was in the pre-internet era, when going online meant attaching a telephone line to your computer terminal. But people were just beginning to use the phone network as a means of accessing databases remotely, using special terminals like this one that was designed for the Lexis database. Fred realized that although the database was designed as a tool for lawyers, you could also use it as a lexicographical tool by searching for early evidence for particular words. In fact, the lexicographers back in Oxford had just begun to explore the potential of searchable text. And in the early 1980s, just before I arrived on the team, they installed a computer terminal and began to search the very limited range of available so-called online text databases. Since then, of course, more and more collections of texts have become available, covering different varieties of English and periods of time. And of course, we no longer need a special terminal to search them. Just one more piece of history. In the pre-computer age, there was actually one way of searching a few complete texts, because a scholar, one scholar or another, had compiled a word-by-word index to that text by hand, a so-called concordance. The compilers of the first, it's just a remarkably labor-intensive job going through by hand the complete works, say, of Shelley, as we see here, and noting down every occurrence of every word. The compilers of the first edition of the OED acquired as many of these concordances as they could, and in the mid-20th century, computers began to be used to generate more concordances of this kind. When I started work on the dictionary in 1987, one of the things we had to do for every new word that we were working on was to check by hand all of these concordances, so as to pick up on instances of our word in the works of D.H. Lawrence or the works of Eugene O'Neill or William Faulkner, whoever had been concordanced in the concordances you can see on the right. So if you find an OED entry for a word in which the earliest quotation is from one of these authors, it may be because that was the earliest quotation that could be found at that time, because you couldn't just search a database, you had to search paper databases. And the chances are pretty good that with such a word, you'll now be able to antedate that word with a simple search of Google Books or the Internet Archive or whatever. More generally, it's still true that if we haven't revised an entry since it was first published, you have a good chance of being able to antedate it if you simply look in resources that weren't accessible at the time the entry was compiled. And even with entries that we revised a couple of decades ago, most of the databases that we now routinely check when we're revising an entry just weren't available. That's why we launched an appeal to the public to help with looking for new antedatings to words beginning with the letters M to R, which is what we were working on back in the noughties. And the appeal's been very successful. Since we launched it in 2020, just at the beginning of the pandemic, people have sent in hundreds of antedatings. And of course, there are plenty of sources that can't be searched online. And when I say source, I don't just mean a published book or anything printed. Any piece of text that can be reliably dated can be used as evidence. So here we see the word psephology, meaning the study of elections. And we can see that it's used in an unpublished letter sent in 1949, which now appears as our first quotation for the word psephology. In fact, the letter appears to have been written more or less on the day that the word was coined by C.S. Lewis and his chums. So if you're looking at any kind of text that isn't well known or might not have been accessible to the OED editors at the time, you may find an antedating. My next example is from a more unconventional source, but the same principle applies if the text can be reliably dated. And in this case, the manuscript we can see on the right, a beautiful illuminated text known as the Galston Psalter, has been dated to circa 1320, and so it can be used as evidence. And if it's an antedating, we will find a way, whatever it is, of citing it. So you see there a marginal illustration in the Galston Psalter. Fox carrying off goose. Goose says, quack. And here's one more example to show that a quotation doesn't even have to be written down for us to use it. A piece of audio or video, which can be reliably dated, is just as much a piece of linguistic evidence as a piece of written or printed text, and can be transcribed and used in the OED. And of course, a piece of actual text, actual letter-by-letter text, doesn't have to exist physically on a piece of paper or parchment, or for that matter, on a gravestone or a stained glass window, both of which we have used as quotations. For the last few decades, some texts have only had an electronic existence in the form of emails, social media, and various other forms of digital communication. Now, we do have to be careful about dating this kind of electronic evidence. A blog post, for example, might appear to have been written on a particular day or date. But if you're looking at it on the web now, generally there is no guarantee that it hasn't been edited after that original date of posting. There are a few archives that preserve electronic-only texts in their original form as far back as the 1980s and even a little earlier. So, for example, our first quotation for the word unsubscribe is from Usenet, one of the earliest online discussion forums. And thanks to the Internet Archive, it is now possible to see archived copies of web pages going back to the 1990s. So whatever you're looking at or listening to, you may come across an antedating, but some caution is required. Not everything that looks like an antedating will turn out to be one. My next slide shows a fairly obvious example. When I was recently checking in the Internet Archive for antedatings of the late 20th century science fiction word hoverboard, which became well known largely through its use in the movie Back to the Future 2, I was briefly excited to find the word in a book published in 1825. But as you can see, although it's the same sequence of letters, it's not the same word at all. It's representing a particular way of pronouncing the word overboard. And my next slide shows a much less obvious example of this kind of error. I'm going to talk you through it. This error did actually make its way into the OED, although it's now been corrected. Thanks to a printed transcription of a letter from 1775, that's the top image, we thought that that letter of 1775 was the earliest known example of the adjective fake pilots, you can see. But when I came to revise the OED entry for this word a few years ago, I became suspicious that this one example was so much earlier than any other example of the word I could find. The next earliest evidence I could find anywhere was from 1879. That's for the adjective fake. And even the noun fake couldn't be found anywhere before the 1820s, and the verb to fake just a little bit earlier than that. So I was suspicious, and I asked one of our researchers to check the original letter in an archive, and it, as you can see from the third image, it turns out to have been misread. The actual word written was false. So in fact, the general rule is if you find something that looks like an absolutely huge antedating, then be very suspicious, because usually it isn't. Not always, but usually. As for good places to look for antedatings, I've already mentioned the Internet Archive and Google Books, which are two of the most important places to look online for general antedatings, along with the HathiTrust Digital Library. For the 19th and 20th centuries, the various big newspaper databases can be very useful. None of them were available in the early noughties, so many entries that were edited at that time can be antedated from these databases. For earlier periods of English, there are early English books online, EBO as we call it, and ECHO, 18th century collections online. And there are many databases relating to particular regional varieties of English or specialist subject areas. New material is constantly being added to most of these databases. So even in an OED entry which has been checked against them by our researchers or by an editor like me, it may be worth rechecking. And as I've said, database searching isn't the only way to find antedatings. You might be looking at a manuscript in a library or a printed document that has never been made available electronically and therefore not searchable, or watching an old movie or TV program or listening to an old record. Antedatings can turn up anywhere, and they can transform our understanding of the history of the word. Sometimes it's simply a case of realizing that a word is older than we thought. For example, when we first published an OED entry for the word rom-com, the earliest evidence we could find was from 1971, but subsequently another of our regular contributors sent in an example from a Canadian newspaper of 1963. Sometimes the earlier than we thought phenomenon can be much more dramatic. So, for example, when we first revised the entry for white lie, our first quotation was from the 1740s, but in 2017, an example was found by somebody who was transcribing a manuscript letter written in the 1560s. And what that tells us that the metaphor, so the word is 200 years older than we thought. And it means the idea of a particular kind of lie being figuratively described as white is 2 centuries older than we thought. And sometimes some early evidence for a word turns up which is in a quite different sense. So, for example, the OED used to define a dipstick as a rod for measuring the depth of liquid, probably most familiar as the thing you use to check the oil level in your car. But when we came to revise the entry and searched through the usual databases for antedatings, we discovered a whole collection of evidence showing that it was originally used as a rather dismissive word to refer to a person whose job it was to dip a stick into things. So a government official who did that to check on the level of liquid in a cask of brandy or whatever. So the history of a word can really be enriched by antedatings. They certainly help us to improve the picture of the language that the OED provides. And I happen to think that finding them can be fun, so I'd encourage you to have a go. Thank you.